Hello, everyone. Welcome into our latest edition of SIECUS Online, Disability and Intersectional Identity. Thank you so much for joining us today for another important conversation. I'm so glad to have you here. And I know we've had some folks steadily trickling in, and hopefully that just continues to increase for all those who registered. This will be available by recording too. So for folks who have registered, if you know someone who's registered and is unable to be here, they will have access to the recording as well. Let's see. Before we, I want to go ahead and get started because I want us to make sure we have time for our conversation and leave plenty of time for our audience to ask questions. So first, let me introduce myself. My name is Gabby Doyle. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the State Partnerships Manager here at SIECUS Sex Ed for Social Change. SIECUS was founded in 1964 to be the leading voice for shame-free education on human sexuality and a champion for sexual and reproductive freedom as an essential part of the human experience. SIECUS asserts that sex education is a powerful vehicle for social change. We are the only national organization solely focused on advocating for rights of all people to accurate information, comprehensive sex ed, and the full spectrum of sexual and reproductive health services. At SIECUS, we believe that sex ed can spark social change as the nexus of many social justice movements, from racial justice and LGBTQ rights to the Me Too movement and the urgent conversations around consent and healthy relationships. Thank you for joining us for SIECUS Online, a series of virtual armchair discussions sponsored by B-Vibe that explore how sex education can be a vehicle for social change with leading experts in the field. B-Vibe's core mission is to empower exploration through education. By offering a constant array of accessible content, carefully written guides, and real-world information, the brand promotes inclusivity and informed play. SIECUS Online seeks to explore the latest sex ed topics with the folks who know the most about them. All proceeds from SIECUS Online events support invited speakers and SIECUS's work advancing progressive sex ed policy across the United States. Tonight's event is Disability and Intersectional Identities, where we will explore the urgent need for sex education to be responsive to students with disabilities in a manner that recognizes and affirms their varying identities, such as race, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Before we get in, there's just a few housekeeping items I have to go over. So as you know, we are using Zoom webinar, which means that all participants are muted and video cameras are turned off, but feel free to continuously chat in the chat box. Feel free to respond to things people are saying. We definitely want an active chat box to create a sense of people actually listening to us, not just speaking to ourselves. I think that folks really enjoy that as speakers. Feel free to use the chat in the chat function as usual. This can be seen by all audience members, or you can chat with just the speakers. There's also a Q&A box that we invite you to use to submit your questions. These will be moderated by SIECUS Senior Policy Advisor, the lovely Allison Macklin, who will help pull audience questions during the Q&A portion of this evening's event. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. If we are not able to respond to your question, we will do our best to collect unanswered questions and provide you with a brief response. I'll go ahead and provide my email in the chat at some point so you can reach out if you feel your question wasn't answered and you'd like more information on the topic. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all who registered for the event. We also plan to post the recording on the SIECUS website at www.siecus.org. The recording should be made available publicly early next week, ideally. As with many nonprofit organizations, the coronavirus pandemic continues to promote economic uncertainty and has impacted SIECUS. And we love for this event to help support and continue to support our work. It's intended as a fundraiser for SIECUS, and we invite you to visit siecus.org/donate to make a contribution so that SIECUS can continue work with the federal, state, and local governments and schools to advance comprehensive sex ed programs and policies. That was a mouthful. All right. With all of that out of the way, I'm so excited to turn to our speakers and get started. We are joined by this evening by some amazing experts in the field. I would love to introduce Dylan Caput. Dylan Caput, they, them, is a queer, trans, non-binary autistic Jew. They're passionate about disability justice and queer and trans liberation. Dylan graduated from Barnard College of Columbia University with a BA in education, Teachers College of Columbia University with an MA in special education, and has had and has 10 years of special education teaching experience. They are currently a doctoral student at the University of Pittsburgh, where their research focuses on creating sex education materials for autistic individuals. Dylan does a lot of activism online on their Instagram at Trans Teachers Tales. And then our second lovely speaker, Robin Wilson-Beat, she, her, is a speaker, writer, and advocate for disability and sexuality, as well as one of the first people to talk about disability, sexuality, and marketing to adult product realtors and manufacturers. She combines years of personal experience with medically sound research to provide a unique perspective on how life and identity impacts one's sexual expression. Her speaking engagements include multiple keynotes and panels, including 3 consecutive years speaking at the Adult Video News Convention in Las Vegas. Her work has not only helped tens of thousands of disabled people, but has also inspired many others to become advocates for sexuality and disability education, an incredibly underserved area. Robin is a member of the Association of American Sexual Educators, Counselors and Therapists, ASECT, the Women of Color Sexual Health Network, WACSHN, and a graduate and member of the San Francisco Sexuality Information Training. Committed to writing her memoir in 2021, she looks forward to sharing her wild journey of Blackness, acquiring a disability via rare illness while pregnant, motherhood, sexuality, and her experiences searching for answers. Robin is a deep-fried Southern woman, mid-century buff, same, love mid-century, and proud mama of 1 son. Thank you both so much for being here tonight to talk about such an important topic. While SIECUS recently released a call to action on comprehensive sex ed for youth with disabilities, we know that discussing the need for advanced sex education for disabled youth is not a one and done conversation, especially as it relates to being responsive to students when considering their intersectional identities and differences between meeting the needs of students with physical and cognitive disabilities. So, getting us started, I have a question that I'd like to use as an opener, and we can go ahead and go back and forth between you two. So during the most recent SIECUS Online, Andrew Ailman, who was the previous moderator, asked this question, and I thought it was such a great way to open up the conversation. So let's start with you, Robin. What is your why? Why are you here today advocating for disability inclusive sex education?
Well, my why started because I was working with youth with disabilities at a Center for Independent Living. And it was in the South. And we had a grant to work on whatever youth-led and designed projects. And generally, our center tended to talk about like things like employment, transportation, and stuff. So, but I was getting questions, and the youth were saying, "Hey, we want to learn about sex. We want to learn about dating. We want to learn like, how do I know when you're supposed to kiss somebody, or how do I ask somebody out on a date?" And and also more complicated questions. And I was trying to do something like create a program, but I got a lot of backlash against it from the director. It was like, "Oh no, we can't talk about sex." And we're not talking about babies. We were talking about people 17 through 28. But that was like this, and this is at a disability center. And so hearing all of that pushback and seeing, the pushback and why these young people didn't have that education, because people weren't, allowing them, or thinking that, "Oh, no, these are disabled youth. They can't have, sex ed, they're not supposed to be having sex," that sort of thing. So that is, which is, of course, BS. So that just kind of lit the fire under myself and that's my why, because that's what instigated that. Not to mention, all the other things that I experience as a person with a disability and my sexuality. But those youth, that was my catalyst. They were my why.
Thank you so much, Robin. It's such a frustrating thing that we know, like across the United States, young people with disabilities are viewed as asexual and not needing sex ed, and left having to figure stuff out for themselves and ask their peers. And it's and not only unfortunate, but such a huge injustice. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Dylan. The question is, what's your why, and why are you here today in this webinar, advocating for disability inclusive sex education?
So my why is a why that I hear a lot in the field of queer people and trans people and disabled people, which is that I'm here doing this because I didn't get any. I think that, it is very true that I was having unsafe sex for many years because nobody told me that two people with vaginas could have safe sex. And then you add in, being autistic and being trans, and people were not talking about my body or my sex life. I think that my why is I want to make sure other people don't, get left out of the system the way that I did. Why am I here doing this work? Is that I have been given this immense privilege of being given entrance to the academy. And the academy is an ableist place filled with institutional ableism, and most disabled people do not get entrance to the academy. So as an autistic person who is like one of the few autistic doctoral students that I'm aware of, I now have this immense privilege to create change for my community in a world that listens to people with PhDs. I happen to know that many disabled people know a lot more than many PhDs about disability, but as someone who has the capacity to create change, the backing of a huge research institution, I have now believed that it is my duty to go back and deliver to my community something that I was not given. Several other questions, we'll get a little bit more into why, but I think that, why am I doing this? Because I didn't get it, and because I now have this really awesome power and privilege to do this work with the backing of an institution and money, which most disabled people never see.
Thank you so much, Dylan. So true. All right, well, I'm going to shift it a little bit to start a little bit more broadly. This is a two-part question. But first, so what is sex ed that's inclusive and respectful towards youth with both physical and cognitive disabilities include? What are some basics you would say that are mandatory that we're still not seeing across the country? We can kick it back over to Robin. Yeah. Okay.
One of the things, some of the things are, like, what would that look like? Some of the stuff some of the things that the topics, like, you totally need to include, you need to cover sexual health, sexual, orientation, puberty, contraception, masturbation, relationships, pregnancy, dating, pleasure, consent, and, sexual assault. Those are, when you're thinking about like comprehensive, but, when we're thinking about, so we're talking about disability, then you also have to make sure that the material is accessible for them. Like, what, you have to think about the examples of also, like, you have to look at what information is out there, how it's presented. But also the information needs to be presented so that students of all different levels of ability are able to understand the material in a way that is meaningful to them, that they can connect with. And that might look differently, for, people that, you might have to use like you have to use like photos or, story pictures, like use like story graphs and things like that to get the education across. You have to kind of think about, teachers need to learn to meet students where they are and their learning styles, and you need to address that.
Yes, exactly. I think just like the quote of like teachers need to meet students where they are is so true. Every single sex ed classroom is different, and you have different kids in there of different ages and experiences and coming from different backgrounds. So exactly. Dylan, did you want to add anything to that, the first part of that question?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, my end goal in life is to publish a sex ed curriculum for K-12 schools. And I think Robin just listed like all of the chapters of the curriculum and exactly which each topic that needs to be covered. So I'm gonna go back and watch this recording and use it to write my curriculum. But so I read a lot of research in academia, and I hate that research informs practice and not the opposite, because I think it's what perpetuates harm. But actually, I have read a lot of research on sex ed for disabled folks. And I'm hoping that since you all are here, you already know this, but a lot of current research, like 2020, 2021, says that disabled people are all asexual, uninterested in sex, incapable of having sex, and just like perpetuates a lot of harm against the disability community. So I'm hopeful that we're all on the same page of knowing this is not true. Of course, there are asexual disabled folks, just like there are asexual non-disabled folks, but the majority of disability community members actually are like very interested in sex and dating and relationships. And when I think about sex education, I think of it the same way I think about math education. It's a skill set like that has to be taught explicitly. I think that I'm in autism world. And so I think that when we think about sex ed, a lot of it is like socially taught, socially passed around knowledge from peers and parents, but autistic youth normally have no social circle, or at least not a healthy one, and very few social skills to navigate the world. So it's a lot of very explicit instruction. And I really am team, like there is research coming out of all academic institutions about explicit instruction in other fields. And then people are like, you absolutely are not teaching sex ed skills. So I'm happy that we are starting to move away from that trend, but it does suck that a big barrier to sex education for disabled folks is that people think of it as asexual. And I'm seeing a question that says research that's working to change that. So the research that I read is like pretty recent, and I actually hate academic research on disability because almost none of it's written by disabled folks themselves in the education field. So I almost ask that if you're looking for research on the subject, you don't, and you go follow disabled people talking about their sex lives online instead. Yeah, I tell people in the academy all the time, I don't read academic research on disability because it's all done by non-disabled folks, and it's very upsetting to me. But to answer your general question of what does sex education that is inclusive and respectful look like? First of all, just acknowledge that your disabled students are having sex and are interested in sex and relationships and dating and like need the skills to do so.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was like, I had some other things that, to mention.
Go for it.
Too. Like, when we're talking about, things that, of course, like the information on body parts, but, and all that stuff, and personal, but also like personal care, hygiene, but also medical examinations, talking about, I know that all ties into like sex health, but that's important. You need to tell people, what's going on, step-by-step instructions, repeat, reinforce, and, practice skills, as far as like putting on like a condom or, things like that. But also, but when I was thinking about accessibility, like large print, captioning in the videos, maybe suction cups on the bottoms of models, like say you're, doing, demonstrating condoms or something like that, but also using, like I said, like lots of pictures, photos, and hands-on activities that are biologically and age-appropriate information in like a cognitively appropriate way. I thought those are just some. I did a presentation on sex ed and special ed, and so I learned a lot. But also, seeing what's already out there and what has worked, and so I wanted to mention that as well.
Robin just touched on this a little bit, but Gabby, if I can just add a couple of things. One, I think that like people get upset that I want to do sex ed work in K-12 schools because they think I want to teach sex ed to kindergartners. And I don't think that 5-year-olds need to know that sex feels nice and masturbation is good for you. But I think that kindergartners need to know that, like, you need to ask someone before you hug them and what their vagina and penises are called. So I think that it's super important to think that when, we're talking about sex ed, we're talking about the right to information about your bodies. We're talking about the right to autonomy over your bodies, which most disabled people never get. We're talking about communities that are at risk for sexual violence and sexual abuse times a lot. So we're talking about prevention, but we're also talking about just like human rights to information about one's own body. And then Robin was just talking about actual format. So Robin brought up, like, how do you ask someone on a date? That is like a very hard thing to teach, but something that like people should know. I'm 26. I have no idea how to ask someone on a date. Nobody ever taught me that. And so I think the value of like role play and like navigating situations with like real live hands-on scenarios is just so important, and also just like a good form of education in general. We're going to talk about this more later, but like all things that you would use to make education more disability inclusive is good for everyone. So I am team just like make everything you do educationally better for everyone by including, disability literacy type activities.
Exactly, and this actually ties in really nicely to the second part, but we know that when sex ed is inclusive of LGBTQ youth, it reduces rates of bullying and harassment by peers. So we can also not assume, but can see that when sex ed is inclusive of young people with disabilities, it also probably includes acceptance among peers and understanding of their lived experiences as well. So it helps everyone improves from inclusive sex ed. So that being said, a second part of this question is that we know that all youth with disabilities experience unique barriers in sex ed. How do young people with further marginalized identities, including but not limited to LGBTQ youth and youth of color, experience further challenges in receiving inclusive instruction that affirms their unique experiences and identities? And whoever would like to start us off, I feel like you both were doing a really nice back and forth there.
I'll start because I happen to know the statistics on LGBTQ youth and disabled youth. The overlap between those communities is very high, like really high, like to the point where 70% of all autistic people are LGBTQ plus. That's a big number. So that means that if you are teaching LGBTQ youth of color, you are also teaching disabled people and vice versa. There is actually, I have never walked into a classroom and been like, no disabled people in here. There are disabled people in every classroom. And I'm in special ed and people are always like, but I teach gen ed. You don't. There are disabled students in your classroom, whether you know it, whether they're diagnosed or not. So I actually tell every teacher I know to approach the situation as though you are teaching a student with a marginalized identity and go from there, because the reality is most of your students probably are. So yeah, I mean, the reality is that like we know LGBTQ inclusive sex ed does not really happen in most schools. We know that people are not really teaching like specifically POC friendly sex ed. Like the reality is if you are not like a white, able-bodied, neurotypical cis het person, you're probably getting nothing out of sex ed whatsoever. And so I think really it comes from a place of like, we need to revolutionize the whole field. I can tell you that like I am autistic, but a lot of the harm that was caused to me in sex ed was actually as a queer and trans person, because I was just not getting information about the sex I was having or having sex with someone with a body like mine. Yeah, so I think that, I think that really sex ed needs a total like revamp, but really just everyone needs good sex ed and most people are not getting it. Yeah, I mean, the reality is most disabled students in segregated special ed classrooms are not getting any sex ed, definitely not sex ed that speaks to them. I have lots of thoughts on inclusion and self-contained classrooms on my Instagram, but I think there are lots of things happening, but I think that, sex ed needs to happen for marginalized students, and most students are not getting information about them and their bodies. Yeah, Robin.
And when I was thinking about this, I mean, one of the components that I had in talking, like when I was thinking about, okay, what students with disabilities and marginalized identities, thinking about how I think that disability justice is also an important part of this work as well as teaching, you know, as part of this, as part of the work of teaching, yes, you know, including, you know, the principles of that. But, you know, one of the main principle of centering, you know, the voices and experiences of people of marginalized identity, and, you know, allowing them like leadership opportunities, you know, and all of that kind of stuff. But but that entails, you know, queerness, you know, talking, you know, being, you know, queer, LGBTQIA, you know, and that, and I totally was going somewhere with that, but yes. Oh, but the other barriers though that these students are facing, it's more than also just like your disability, also like religion, like religious communities, and that impacts you. And I guess I know I keep talking all the time about being from the South, but you know, the South, there, you know, there's a whole world out there, you know, the whole country that, you know, sections of the country where you have people that have a very strong voice about how they feel other people should believe. So as you know, we can see in Texas right now and other places. So, and all of that impacts how these, you know, how they're getting the information, or how, you know, people are going to allow you to have that information. So that's another further way that people are marginalized, I feel too. You know, we're talking about regions, and, you know, because we don't have the same culture across the United States. We may all be in one nation, but, you know, depending on where you are, you have different rights and, you know, and laws. So I just think that that's something too that we need to be keep in our heads, and when we are trying to teach about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Dylan, did you want to add something before I jumped in?
Well, I just want to say Robin said something along the lines of like knowledge is power. And I think that's so important, and to remember that like adults have the capacity to gatekeep knowledge, and society gatekeeps knowledge from disabled people all the time. And a lot of the knowledge that is gatekept from disabled people is about like their own bodies and like their own rights and their own abilities to navigate systems. So just like when we are having this conversation, I think it's really important to think about the harm that we are perhaps causing as schools when we are not giving disabled students autonomy and agency and information, right? Like disabled students are not getting information about their own bodies. And I think that like we know what kind of harm that causes and the capacity that has to cause harm later. So I think as we think about knowledge being power, just remember that disabled people are consistently gatekept from knowledge about themselves.
Thank you. Can you hear me right now? My Zoom has been doing this fun thing this week, or when I'm on large meetings where it doesn't let me click anything. So we're just going with it. So I'm glad I'm off mute. But thank you. Yes. And something I wanted to add really quickly related to this and related to what Robin was just talking about is, especially when we're thinking about regional sex ed, like Alabama just now this session mandated sex ed to be medically accurate, and also removed requirements that make sex ed providers teach that LGBTQ identity is actively harmful and bad and is just very homophobic. And so we know not only that there's an absence of affirming instruction, but lots of states, not proactively, that's not the right word, but include intentionally harmful instruction on LGBTQ identity. So we have a lot of work to do in that sector too. So in a similar vein, and I got a little bit of ahead of myself. Yes.
Can I just respond to something that was said in the chat?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I am seeing a question that I get asked all the time, which is like, how do I tell people that sex ed for disabled folks matters? And I get this question all the time. And like in my dream utopia of a world, we all get to walk into a school and say, hello, I'm here to tell you why disability inclusive sex ed matters. And the school's like, great, go ahead. And we're like, because disabled people deserve healthy and safe and affirming love and sex and relationships. And the school's like, great, teach what you want. But I am much too jaded at this point to say that that works. And so I hate to play the sex education as prevention game because I don't think it's fair. I think that people deserve sex education because they are human. I have this conversation about LGBTQ inclusive sex ed all the time. But when schools don't listen, I pull the statistics. I pull the statistics on the number of disabled folks who are in jail for preventable behavior. I pull the statistics on the high rates of sexual assault and abuse in the disability community of people who were not given information. The number of autistic folks on sex offender registries for masturbating in public when someone could have told them in a sex ed classroom not to do it is very large. The same goes true, right? Like we don't want queer and trans kids killing themselves or getting STIs, but that's what happens when you don't give them sex ed. So I hate playing the education as prevention game because I prefer the education as a human right game. But I do suggest that if you are trying to get adults to listen to you, there are so many like real resource lists and statistics out there about what happens when we are not having these conversations. I love Advocates for Youth, Robin, so that is a great resource. But I think that the conversation with adults is like, here's what happens when you don't, then you don't want this to happen, but here are the life outcomes for when we don't have this conversation. Again, in Dylan's utopia, in their head, we are just like, everyone deserves sex and love and we're done, but that's not where we're at in 2021. So I do suggest the education as prevention game with schools and parents if you need to play that.
Yes, thank you. Perfect. So moving on to the next question. So I did get a little bit, and this is definitely related, I did get a little bit ahead of myself earlier by talking about this, but we know that when sex ed is inclusive to LGBTQ youth, like I was saying, it also benefits their heterosexual and cisgender peers and creates a more affirming environment in which LGBTQ youth experience less harassment and bullying. Do you think similar benefits are achieved when sex education instruction is more inclusive to the needs of all youth with disabilities? Whoever would like to take it off, maybe, you know, this, if you want to think about it for a moment as well.
Sorry, I'm sitting here going, okay, resources, and like trying to just like let people know, like some great resources. And yes, and I will send
totally fine. Yeah,
to all of the participants because I have it all in the nice.
Yeah, we'll definitely send out any resources to all of those who registered. So yes, please don't feel like you need to scramble. But yes, thank you for being so helpful with that.
All right, awesome. But I just kind of I was sharing this one site, Teachers Pay Teachers, where I mean there's good curriculum and then there's bad curriculum, and the bad curriculum is about shaming. Like there was this one story of keep your hands out of your pants, basically, talking about masturbation. But it was, and then I had examples of this is good curriculum and this is not so great curriculum because they were like, if I put my hands in my pants, that's dirty, and so talking about, your body as being dirty and that sort of thing. So it's like, okay, that's very shamey. This one is like, hey, the other one was like, yeah, there's a time and a place and yeah, it feels good, but not, we don't masturbate in, out in their classroom and stuff because, that makes other people uncomfortable, that sort of thing. But that was not the question you asked. The question you asked is, we know when sex education is inclusive. Yes, of course it benefits everyone. I feel like similar benefits are achieved when sex education is more inclusive of the needs of all youth with disabilities. Yes, it is, not to mention, because everyone has a right to, sex ed. Everyone has a right to learn about their bodies. Everyone has that right. So when you design a sex ed, curriculum that is inclusive of youth with disabilities, that to me, that's a given. I feel like education should just be accessible anyway, because people benefit in multiple ways. Like, for instance, closed captions. More people than just hearing impaired people use closed captioning. For instance, I have ADHD. Closed captioning and I have an audio processing disorder. So closed captioning helps me understand what's going on, because I will miss words all the time. That's why I hate talking on the telephone, because I'm going to miss because my brain is not, comprehending the words. And so that, that's, and also for people where English is a second language, or they're just learning English or whatever. Subtitles are very, very, closed captioning subtitles are, very, very valuable. So, and that's, so you can see where a piece of like assistive type, an assistive type of use for something can benefit more people, can benefit everyone. And so that's kind of how I see inclusive sex ed. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sure Dylan have a way to put that more out.
So Dylan's going to answer the question, but first Dylan's going to talk about masturbation. So putting your hands in your pants feels good. And teachers always are like, that's inappropriate. And I want to talk about the word inappropriate, because that is a word I hear in classrooms all the time. This behavior is inappropriate. Don't say that, it's inappropriate. Don't do that, it's inappropriate. So for those of us who are autistic or otherwise neurodivergent, or just have brains that don't cooperate all the time, that message gets turned into shame later, like Robin was saying. So I actually think masturbation is completely appropriate. It's just where and when. Masturbation has a lot of health benefits, just not in the classroom. And so I think I don't feel bad talking about this, because this webinar is sponsored by B-Vibe, and that's a sex toy company. So I think that a lot of the work that I do around autistic sex ed is actually around masturbation. I talk about it on my Instagram all the time, because I think access to self-pleasure is a human right. Okay, so I'm done talking about masturbation. So the answer to the question that I was asked is that I think that, like Robin said, making things better for disabled people makes things better for everyone. Those of us who are in the education universe know universal design for learning really well. And making things accessible for disabled learners makes things better for everyone else as well. I also think it's important to note that many disabled people end up in long-term relationships with people who are outside of the disability community, and vice versa. So I actually think that teaching disabled people, teaching everyone about disabled sex ed and disability and disabled bodies really matters, because a lot of those people end up dating each other. And I think it's so, you never know if the next person you fall for is disabled or not. And I think that a huge number of people actually exclude a lot of really wonderful, valuable partners because they do not feel disability competent in the bedroom. And so I think teaching everyone about disabled people have sex, they just might need some different approaches, really opens up everyone's sex and dating life. I know I was going to tell everyone I'm really good at bed, but I think that you are telling people that you are signing yourself up for a life without a lot of really wonderful, rich partners if you don't know anything about disability and sex. And I think that, I think everyone is better off when we understand the differences of people around us. There are disabled people in the world, and learning about difference helps everyone. It's so, there is not a ton of research in my specific field. And so I use a lot of frameworks from LGBTQ sex ed because there is research on that, both because of the overlap and because we know that when you teach people about difference, it creates better things. And so a lot of the academic writing that I do actually applies LGBTQ sex ed frameworks to disability, because I think that it's just true. When you teach people about like people who are different from them, everyone gets a little bit kinder and more inclusive. So I think that, you know, you can't really teach about LGBTQ things and not disability, or vice versa. You can't really tell people you're LGBTQ competent if you're not disability competent. Those things are mutually exclusive. I know a lot of people who are like, I know a lot about LGBTQ things and know nothing about disability. And I would say that you know nothing about LGBTQ things, because the principles of inclusion and affirmation and justice for both communities are very similar. Yeah, that's what I've got to say on that.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you both. Perfect. So our next question is, what best practices or tips do you have for educators to ensure they're being responsive to disabled youth and responsive to disabled youth with additional marginalized identities in particular?
I feel like we've covered some of this, but I am, that, you know, particularly, like I said, being, you know, culturally competent as far as, you know, learning about different communities, but also learning about, when I'm saying is, you know, talking about cultural competency, you hear us talking about it in our field. We hear us talk, you know, like medical fields. Everyone is talking about, hey, you know, we may all live in the same place, but, you know, we are impacted and influenced by the cultures that we are being reared in or living in, you know, and that sort of thing, and need for providers, educators, people like that to understand and to know things. And I think that in particular, I feel like best practices are, yeah, like I said, totally about actually making the curriculum accessible for, you know, that person, because, you know, we all have different learning styles. Everyone has different learning styles. And even though, you know, you might have this traditional way of, hey, okay, we have a lecture and you're going to take notes and then you're going to, you know, take a test, or, you know, make a test or do papers, but that's not how everybody learns. And so you have to have the multiple approaches to teaching the curriculum, and being responsive, and also listen and see, you know, and making sure that they're connecting, and also, you know, give more time, make an allotment of more time, you know, maybe for some lessons and things like that. I think another way is to make sure that in the materials and stuff too, that you have representation, that you are showing in your material. You're not just showing white people in wheelchairs, you know, on a date, you know, or whatever, that you are showing, you know, queer people, that you are showing queer disabled people in your, you know, and that your materials are representative of, everyone that you know, that's in your, you know, in your society. I think that because it is kind of disturbing, you know, if you are, you know, because I'm thinking about back in long time ago, you know, in, you know, late 80s, early 90s, you know, it was sex ed, you know, but all my stuff, you know, it was a bunch of white kids, you know, talk, you know, where they were like, oh, blah, 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 you know, I need to get a pad, I'm started a period, you know, whatever. But the people in the films, the people, you know, or in the books or whatever, we're just talking about white people. And there's also, but somebody else put it on there too, there's also physical access just beyond the learning style. Yes. More like, yeah, making sure that people can, yeah, okay, yes. I'm gonna let Dylan talk, but but that is also, there is more than just that. There's also physical access, yes, that's beyond just the learning style. Just making sure that, you can actually access the materials, that you can, be able, like, if you're blind or something, 3D models of things, there, because, if you're not going to be able to see the material, you need to be able to feel it, and things like that. Yes, and space in the room, all of that kind of stuff. But I'm gonna let Dylan talk.
So I was gonna say one thing, and I am still gonna say it, but want to say something, touch on something Robin said first. Majority of disabilities, like in the global population, are actually not visible. They are invisible disabilities. In disability representation writ large, we see a lot of people who use mobility aids. There are disabled people who use mobility aids, but actually the majority of disabled people have invisible disabilities. So when you are just showing people who use wheelchairs and walkers and canes and hearing aids, you're actually leaving out a huge majority of the disability community. So first of all, representation matters. Don't do that. There's a lot out there for people who have physical disabilities, less out there for those of us who don't. There's a divide even in the disability community between those two communities. But when people are like, I did disability representation, I'm like, yes, you put a white person in a wheelchair, good for you. You have not solved equity. Okay, so that's my one thing, is that if you are only showing people who use mobility aids, you're leaving out a statistically significant majority of the community. Two, I get in trouble for this with Pitt all the time, because people are like, hey, Dylan, you're an academic. What are your best practices or tips for educators? And I'm like, okay, my practices and tips are to stop reading academic research, stop listening to parents, and don't listen to administrators. And people are kind of like, what? And I'm like, everything you've ever heard from someone who doesn't have a disability, forget it, because those people have no clue what they're talking about. I don't care how related you are to a disabled person. If you do not have the lived experiences, I'm not interested in your tips or strategies or practices. So when I want to learn something about how to provide services for a disabled person, I go find disabled people on social media and I send them messages and I'm like, hey, I'm a disabled person. You're a disabled person. I want to make my work better for other disabled people. And we have a great conversation. There are so many disabled people out there who are sex educators who are doing this work for free online. I do this work for free on my Instagram. I also will put my Patreon in the chat where I also answer a lot of these questions, but find disabled people and have these conversations with them and pay them for their labor and time. But really, and all the time at Pitt, people are like, hey, Dylan, like, what academic resources should I look at? Or like, what parents or administrators should I talk to? And I say, no. Honestly, I hear all the time from well-intentioned parents and administrators who have never once spoken to a real live disabled person, but are like, I know everything there is to know about disability because my child is disabled. And I'm like, have you ever talked to a disabled adult? And they're like, well, no. And I'm like, great, here are like 5 people for you to go talk to, and you're not talking to me again until you do. Disabled people are the experts on their own experience. The reason that this doesn't happen is because in the year of our Lord and Savior 2021, people still believe that disabled people are unintelligent. So we are not allowed to be the expert on our own experiences. This does not happen with other groups. Nobody is I hope people are not walking around saying trans people are unintelligent, but people walk around and to my face say disabled people have lower IQs. That is factually incorrect. If you are interested in practices or tips for working with disabled people, ask disabled people. We are not doing this in other fields. Like when we want to know things about talking to people with other identities, we ask them themselves. We don't do this in disability world. I am begging you to please start. Everything I know, I have learned from other disabled people. I don't listen to non-disabled people on disability. I'm not interested in their perspectives. And I recommend you try to do the same, because otherwise I promise you are accidentally harming the people you are trying to help. And yeah, this is recorded and someone's going to show my advisor, and I hope she gets a kick out of it. She took me on knowing this is who I was, but truly, like, I love being in academia and telling people not to read academic research, but I stand by that. If you are interested in serving the disability community, go talk to disabled people themselves. And that, yeah, that's my best advice to anyone who wants to help disabled people, is talk to disabled people about what they wish they had.
Thank you. That was great. All right, so we are actually at our last question before we turn the discussion over to audience questions. So if you've had questions that have come up, please feel free to pop them in the chat, pop them in the Q&A. Allison is collecting them for us, and we'll go ahead and go through them at the end to answer those questions for you. My email, because like I said, my Zoom does not like me. If you would like to email any questions to my personal email that I can pass along to our lovely speakers, it's G-O-D-Y-L-E, gdoyle@siecus.org. Perfect. So before we turn it over to questions, do each of you have any final thoughts regarding the topic of disability inclusive sex ed, or how disability intersects with other identities young people hold? And we're doing fantastic on time, so please feel free to talk as freely as you'd like to this.
No, I guess my last thing, because I actually have the same question. It's like, okay, so how do we show invisible disabilities? You know, okay, maybe that needs to wait for question and answer, but I did actually think about that, and it's like, yes, and I really like the fact that Dylan brought that up, you know, about the, you know, high percentage of people with invisible disabilities. You know, you're talking about like chronic pain and, you know, ADHD, autism, you know, they're the list, there's a huge long list. Diabetes, but it's also, you know, you also have to think too that, you know, that these things there might be conditions that are disabilities, but people with them, they don't have the framing or thinking around that disability as a disability. Because for instance, I have friends that have really bad Crohn's disease, like bad, and, you know, and had to have a colostomy bag, you know, as a result, and that sort of thing. And I know people that have that just, you know, or I'm disabled, proud, this is, you know, this is how this impacts me, blah, blah, blah. And then I have friends like, I don't know if that's really disabled. And I was like, okay, you know. And so I don't know why I felt like, but I did want to mention that I guess it's kind of it. I am also very interested in knowing how you portray or talk about the invisible disabilities, especially with sex ed.
Can I answer that? So, yeah, I'm gonna, you know, as I said, a lot of LGBTQ things frame or form my approach to things. So I'm actually gonna use that example, which is that sometimes people make assumptions about me based on the way that I look. And that is how we are as humans. But actually, just like you can't look at someone and tell if they're gay or trans or a lesbian, you can't look at someone and tell if they're disabled. And so when people are like, but how do I show representation of a person with invisible disability? I say, take a picture of a person, tell people this person has a disability. And then when people are like, but they look like everyone else. Well, yes, people with invisible disabilities look like everyone else. We get into like such an issue in all communities when we're like, this person looks gay, this person looks trans, this person looks disabled. Honestly, like, fuck all of that, because there is no such thing as looking like any identity under the LGBTQ umbrella or under the disabled umbrella. Like, people have identities that you can't tell from looking at them. That's part of the human experience. The thing I hear from people most at this point in my life is, you look like a man, Dylan. people think I look like a man because I have a beard, but I'm not a man. Therefore, I don't look like a man. There we go. Case solved, problem done. But people are like, you don't look autistic. What does looking autistic mean to you? Like, do you want me? I'm sorry, I don't look autistic, but there's no such thing as looking autistic, just like there's no such thing as looking like a man. It's all made up. So when people are like, how do I show invisible disability? Pick a picture of a human and put them there. And when people are like, I don't think this person looks disabled, explain that disability doesn't have a look. I think we often cause more problems when we are trying to solve them by perpetuating the idea that people look a certain way. And again, we have this, Robin, to what you said, I saw a tweet that was like, if you have ever said, am I blank enough? You have that identity, because if you don't have that identity, you would not be sitting here going, am I blank enough, right? Like every gay person is like, am I gay enough? Every trans person is like, am I trans enough? Congratulations. That's how you know you have that identity. So I think, we're all always asking the question of how do we show what invisible identities look like? But the reality is you just pick a picture of a person and explain I think it's a great learning opportunity for other people that there is no one look to an identity. I ask that we, collectively as a group agree to do that, that we will teach young ones that there is no way to look like anything. If you have a question about a person's identities, just ask them. I think that is, the same way we ask pronouns. I ask people like, if you're curious about someone's identity, like ask them. If that person's offended, that's on them, but your curiosity is normal. Kids are curious beings, and I think we need to encourage curiosity. Yeah, so that was my response to Robin's question. My last thought that I'll leave you with is what I already said, which is that if you have questions about disability, please ask disabled people. I am asking you so strongly as soon to be Dr. Dillon to stop asking non-disabled people for expertise on disability. I don't care how long that person has been in education. I don't really care if that person has a PhD. I don't really care if that person has a son or a best friend who's disabled. If that person is not they themselves disabled, I do not ask them for their thoughts, opinions, or anything having to do with disability. The same way I don't ask cis people about trans things. I don't care if you're cis and you've studied trans people for 50 years, I am not talking to you. And so I just really am asking that if you have questions about an identity, you go to someone with that identity. I hope there are teachers and parents and administrators here who are going to stop doing harmful things tomorrow and will go find disabled people on social media and Twitter and read about them and their experiences and pay them for their time and energy, because that is really like the only way forward, is to listen to disabled people.
Thank you both so much for your wonderful insight. So that concludes our panel portion of tonight's programming. So we have about a half hour for questions. We do have a hard stop at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we do have a lot of questions that we've accumulated throughout this program. But first, if anyone is hopping off now, thank you so much for joining tonight. Please feel free to follow our wonderful speakers on their online platforms, which are all featured on our online promotion for this event. You can find all relevant information there. And thank you so much for joining. And thank you again, Robin and Dylan, for everything you've provided during this panel. It's been so great. So we're going to turn it over to some Q&A questions now. Perfect. So we have a decent amount. So again, if we don't get to your question, we do have it saved. And we are noting some names if people provided names. And if we don't get to yours, ideally, we will be able to reach out. But if not, please feel free to email me, gdoyle@siecus.org, and we'll be happy to connect you. So first, Michelle Hope would like to know, how do we best support for example, trainings or resources, teachers, parents, and stakeholders to empower them to know how to continue the information and education beyond the classroom? And for these questions, you both don't need to answer. Whoever would like to answer, if you'd both like to answer, this is however you'd like to approach these questions. And if there's not an answer right now, we can also connect over email.
Gabby, can you put it somewhere?
Yeah, Allison, do you mind popping in? I don't have the ability to put anything or see anything in the chat, unfortunately, but I can reinstate it as Allison is working to pop it in the chat again.
Yeah, can you say it again?
Yeah, for sure. So Michelle is wondering, what are the best ways to support teachers and parents to help them access this information and education? Is it trainings? Is it in resources? Is it meetings? Do you all have any thoughts about that?
Go ahead, Robin.
Okay. Wait, am I okay? I was thinking about, okay, as far as getting like like getting the community basically involved in continuing the education and with parents. Is that, what the question was? But I was busy. I was finding the resource. A book just came out this year called, and it's on that list that I'm sending, but it is called, came out by Routledge. It was printed by Routledge. It's called Sexuality for All Abilities, Teaching and Discussing Sexual Health and Special Education. And in that book, there is a chapter on talking with parents, and that was like one of the chapters, and how to approach and manage like parental attitudes. And but I have not really seen a lot on how do we reinforce and continue the education, like I guess just beyond the classroom. I am also interested in knowing more about that. That's another question I would like to ask. I mean, I would like answered as well. There are resources for parents on how to talk with your kids with developmental disabilities and sexuality. And there's an online course through Elevatus Training that, workshops about talking, with your kids with disabilities about sex ed. I'm sitting here trying to think of some of the other, what was the other part of the question?
I think Allison was just able to rejoin us. Allison, if you could repop the question in the chat, that'd be beautiful. But that was really the question, is how do we best support people to access this information, all this wonderful information? Is it reports, trainings? But I think that was a great answer. And honestly, if anyone, as we're in this space together, if you have thoughts about questions, feel free to also pop it in the chat. That's great. So yeah, Allison is about to pop it in the chat. Dylan, if you have an answer, if you don't, also totally fine. And then, yeah, we can move on to the next question afterwards.
So I guess I'll just plug myself, because I do paid private consulting with schools and families on this topic exactly, as a doctoral student and someone in the field. My email, I'll put my email in the chat again, but I do a lot of work with schools and families around this topic exactly, and can help. If I can't help you, I can point you in the direction of other disabled adults who are doing this work. When I talk to parents about why are you not comfortable having these conversations, a lot of what I hear is like, my parents didn't teach me about this, or like, I didn't get sex ed, or like, I'm not talking to my son about masturbation, I don't masturbate. And so I think some of the like really cool revolutionary work that I get to do with parents is kind of like, okay, start masturbating, like go have conversations with your parent friends and your partners about like sex and sexuality, because the more comfortable you are with your own body, like it is easier to talk to your kids about it. my mom, who is not here, is an autistic psychiatrist. And when I started asking questions, she was like, here is the information. And, you know, I was never told it was inappropriate. I was never told I could not have access to information. And it is because my mom was so comfortable with her own stuff that I'm comfortable with it, right? So when we think about not passing down generational trauma, so much of it is about like having parents doing their own work, go to therapy, talk about why you're uncomfortable with it, and then start talking to your kids. I think that when I talk to teachers who are uncomfortable talking about it, they say very similar things of like, it's not that they don't want to talk to kids about it, it's that they're comfortable talking about it on their own. And so I think part of my ask for adults is like, get comfortable. It is easier to talk to kids about things when you're comfortable with them. Again, a lot of the LGBTQ work I do is like, if you're not homophobic, it's easier to talk about gay things to kids. So yeah, I say do a little bit of your own work, but also, again, I'll put my email in the chat. I do a lot of paid consulting with families and schools and administrators around this topic exactly, professionally and personally. It's a topic I'm invested in. It is also how I pay the bills. So please feel free to reach out if you would like. I talk to children about this all the time. So yeah, it's a conversation I am happy to help you have. But also I recommend that adults do a little bit of their own work because it makes it much easier to talk to children when you're not uncomfortable. It also makes your life better and more pleasurable and easier.
Thank you. So our next question is from Olivia. Olivia says, first, thank you so much for this incredibly informative webinar. I'm struggling to provide info in the form of statistics to demonstrate to stakeholders / gatekeepers / grant funders who pay for the services for people with disabilities that comprehensive and accessible sexuality education is critical and essential for people with disabilities. I get Dylan's point about research and also wondering if there's any you'd actually recommend.
Yeah, so yeah, my point about research is that it's dangerous. And so my point about research is use it wisely. I do use research to do what I was talking about before, which is kind of to play the education as prevention game, which again, I don't love because I think that I want research, and this is part of the research that I'm doing, that is like, hey, when we give people sex ed, they are happy and healthy and have good relationships. But that research like doesn't super exist in the disability field yet, at least not that I'm aware of. If it does, please let me know, because I would love to use it. But the statistics that I do use are statistics on people who are involved with the legal system, statistics on sexual abuse and sexual assault of disabled people, statistics on sex offender registries. All of that is out there. All of it is research I'm very familiar with. I hate having to use, but is research that is done by non-disabled people, I think, with the goal of like helping to do what you want to do, which is provide services. So I recommend looking for research with the angle of using it to say, this is what we don't want for our disabled youth and adults, and sex ed is a way to prevent that. It is kind of a blurry link between like sex ed is a way to prevent that, and here's what happens. That's part of the work that I'm trying to do personally. But yeah, I say that, you know, some of the statistics exactly what Robin's saying in the chat. Like there's so much stats out there about like things that we are hoping to avoid. And the link is like, okay, how can we avoid this? Give people information about their bodies. Again, I'm doing a lot of writing around this topic right now. Happy to I do share that on my Patreon when it's finished. But yeah, that is research that I'm kind of like, okay, it sucks to use and I wish it didn't exist at all for a variety of reasons. But like, if you have to pull statistics on prevention, that is research that I know that schools listen to, because people who serve young people don't want them, you know, in trouble. So yeah.
I was just gonna add that, actually. I was gonna say that I found that in order to get people to fund stuff and to listen, is you have to say, okay, this is what happens when you don't. And this is what happens. So the whole prevention and all that stuff is, you know, of course, you know, it's fear-based, but you're like, okay, do you want to help, keep people with disabilities from being sexually assaulted, blah, blah, blah. Because look at these rates of how people with disabilities are like 7 times, the rate is 7 times higher of, that you're going to be, sexually assaulted, or as Dylan was mentioning about prison and disability and things like that. But, and, maybe sex crimes and stuff like that. But also, pregnancy, STD is always a big one, but especially like contraception. Like contraception, they tend to get a lot more money around that. And then I can also talk about eugenics, if we're talking about that, but that's a whole different topic. That's unfortunately, that's how you get the lay people that are in charge of this money and grants and things like that. That's the kind of stuff that they listen to, and you can find statistics on that, and you can, and not just here, but like statistics in other parts of the world, other countries. Because I also, when people are saying like resources and things or techniques, I don't just look in the United States. I look at what people are doing around the world. And because people have really, really great ideas. It's in Sweden, and they were nurses, special ed teachers who came up with the book to, teach, about sex ed and stuff, but they used also like regular terms that people use for their bodies. And that's the other thing too, using approachable language, using, they used like the colloquial terms for things, for body parts and, sexual acts and things like that, and lots of pictures and things like that. But it was that's where I got all excited about, oh yes, that's the other thing. Yeah, plain language, that's very important. And because a lot of the academic stuff, which is why I've kind of tangled a lot with the academic world, because yes, I believe in giving information in a way that is accessible, and it can be accurate, and it is scientifically, but put it in a way that because that's the thing, language needs to also, the message has to be accessible. And if the language is not accessible because it's wrapped up in all of the academic speaking around theory and blah, 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 then, it's getting the message to the people who actually need that information it gets lost in there. That's my opinion.
So just one more plug, not to exclusively look at academic research full of jargon. You have to pay for it, done by non-disabled people. Yeah, thanks, Robin. That was like excellent follow-up proving my point. We did good.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so the next question is from Kia. Kia says that I find that parents are my biggest barrier in supporting disabled youth in high school. What strategies or tips can you provide in getting parents to understand this important topic?
I put like in the chat, I put a couple of, I put that book, that Sexuality for All Abilities, teaching it, discussing sexual health, because you can look through there and then you can see that, that has a chapter on basically navigating the attitudes of parents and that sort of thing. But I thought I had put in a resource for parents and that I have. And yes, talking with your kids. There's an online course, that parents, that Elevate Us training. And so I'll send a link to that as well. But okay, copy that link. Okay, and I'll put it in the chat. But that there's some things that are out there, not a lot, but some that is approaching, okay, how do you talk to parents and get the parents, to let the parents know that this is important and why it's important. And so I just put a link there in the chat. Because, you know, ultimately, you know, but that is, I think that, you know, maybe being able to, you know, as a parent, you know, because I'm a parent too, and my kid, I have a disability and my kid has a disability. My kid is autistic, and I know that, you know, like you get something saying, oh, you know, can your student participate in this or blah 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 blah, and you sign the note, right? But and some people are like, what? But I think if you need to, sometimes you have to educate the parents first, you know, and let them know, why is this important? Why is this important for your child to know this? And, you know, so some of the same things that you're having to talk about with these grant people, you might have to also kind of talk about with parents as well, and say, you know, this is why this is important for your child to learn, because guess what? They grow up and they're going to be out in, you know, they're going to get older, and, you know, this is, and everybody, it doesn't matter what you're a bit, all humans have a need to learn about their bodies and stuff to keep themselves safe and happy. I kind of put it that way. But, you know, maybe like have maybe a little parental conference, or like a night email or something, you know, just kind of, or something, but, you know, but something to approach the parents of saying why this is a good idea, and why you think the kids need, why their child needs to have this education, this kind of sex education. That's my thought.
Dylan, did you want to add? Oh,
I was just going to say, it's usually parents I show the statistics to, actually. It's usually parents who I'm like, hey, this is the direction that like disabled kids who don't have this information are headed, and it sucks. And like, you probably don't want your kid in prison or like being charged with XYZ thing or on a sex offender registry, because that sucks. And like, I'm sitting here telling you that giving this information is going to prevent that. You know, it's very similar. Parents of trans kids are like, I'm not supporting this kid. And you're like, well, statistics on trans kids committing suicide are 8 times the national average. And parents are like, well, I don't want my kid dead. And I'm like, well, then you have to support your kid. So I think that parents are usually who I show statistics to. I also will say that I am not a parent, but I have very sex positive parents, and like even they don't really want to think about me having sex probably. So I think that like most parents really don't want to think about their kids having sex, whether that kid has a disability or not. Like that's kind of weird to be thinking about. And so I think it is a little bit uncomfortable to say to parents, like, especially parents of disabled youth, like you might need to be a little bit more involved in this conversation, right? Like a lot of what I learned like was through peers and from the internet, and like a lot of disabled people aren't getting that information those places. And so either they get it from, you know, their parents in school, or they don't get it at all. And that's a huge risk factor. So I think part of the conversation like really is, yo, this is gonna suck. Like this is gonna be uncomfortable and unpleasant, but I promise that the alternative is more uncomfortable and unpleasant. Yeah, again, parents are who I actually would start the statistics with. Schools and administrators are a little bit better because their kids are not, those kids are not theirs. So it's much more like, I think we can do this. When I talk to teachers and administrators, their worry is the parents as well. And that's why they don't let it happen. So I think really parents are the big barrier here. I think schools and teachers do want to do this and are worried about parents. So parents are actually majority of the stats conversations I have are with parents. I have been pleasantly surprised at how many parents sign off on these conversations happening as soon as they realize like your kid could end up in real trouble or hurt or like being taken advantage of. Parents don't want that. But yeah, I think parents, the hardest part of my job is parents always, because, you know, teachers are worried about parents and admins worried about parents and kids are worried about parents, and parents are kind of like, you know, the last line of defense. So I think that if you are looking for a place to start with statistics. That's actually where I would start, is bringing them to parents.
Thank you. So depending on time, this may be our last question. Again, if we didn't get to your question and you were not anonymous, we'll try to reach out to you. If not, please feel free to email me, gdoyle@siecus.org, with your question. I'm going to end us on this question. So this is an anonymous question. We form youth advisory councils and youth leadership councils to increase youth input in how our programming is created and taught. Do you have any thoughts on making sure that these groups are accessible to disabled youth?
When there's like making sure that I making sure that yes, all of your, any programs that you have or whatever are inclusive of people with disabilities and are not exclusive, and you're not excluding. You need to look at, okay, so who is on your advisory council, your youth advisory council? Who are the youth on your youth leadership councils? Because often they're young students with disabilities are not given those kind of opportunities, or not given the opportunities to be a part of leadership, youth leadership institutions. There was, because I used to, my job before sex education, I was working in self and systems youth advocacy, and teaching, about self and systems advocacy with young people. And the lack of leadership and opportunities for young people with disabilities to learn about leadership were so lacking that there was a disability youth leadership conference that, and some other, things that I've seen to help, foster and teach youth with disabilities in being leaders and giving leadership skills, because they were being excluded in, the other programs. Because you think about like the selection process for the students who get selected for those kind of things. As somebody who, even way back when, that used to be on like these youth leadership conferences and things like that, they were not inclusive of disability. And so you need to make sure, and a lot of times too, that people will think about disability and they'll think, oh, okay, so we're going to get some people that, have cerebral palsy or, paralysis or whatever. Good, we got it covered. And it's like, no, you need to make sure also the people that miss out the most on these kind of opportunities are youth with intellectual disabilities and cognitive, developmental disabilities are left out of these opportunities, and that's not, and it shouldn't be that. So if you have a way, you're like thoughts on making these groups more accessible, make sure that you are including students from not just the students who were like on the all A honor roll and in the whatever National Honor Society or whatever, making sure that you have an inclusive group of youth who are genuinely so go reach out to the special education rooms, or in classes, those students, invite them to apply, and more than just invite them to apply, include people. That's one of my takes on it. I'm sure Dylan has got a lot more to say about it.
Dylan always has a lot to say. There are people on this webinar who spend a lot of time with me on Zoom who know that I have a lot to say. Yeah, so a couple of things. One, if you do not already know that there are disabled people in your youth advisory and youth leadership councils, you're already doing something wrong. Because those people, when disabled people are not part of your groups, it means they don't feel safe there. And that means that you have not done your job. So if this is your question, I want you to go home tonight, or you're probably home right now, and I want you to think about putting a statement into the world that is like, hey, we here at XYZ Youth Advisory Council are inclusive of people who have, and the name, who are LGBTQ+, who are students of color, who are disabled. I would put a statement out in the world that you are a safe space, because I'm a 26-year-old grown-up, and when I don't feel safe in spaces, I don't go. And I also think it's important to remember, I've talked a lot tonight about the academy. Most institutions, schools, academia, places in the world are not accessible to disabled people. Like, I navigate my life every day assuming that places are not accessible to me. So I would really think about the work that you're doing. I think there's a double-edged sword to Robin's point. Like, I don't like when people seek me out specifically to be the disabled representation in their group, but also if you have not gone to where disabled people are, excuse me, and been like, hey, we're doing this really awesome thing and you are welcome, you know, you're also not doing, you know, you're not creating a safe space. I know we have to end because it's 8:30, but I really, like, if you have further questions, I have not answered your questions because I know I did not answer everyone's questions. Someone had a great question in the chat about asking people with disabilities about consent, getting consent, that I really wanted to answer. So like, please, my email's in the chat, my Instagram's in the chat, get in touch, hire disabled people to answer these questions. I'm really, this is like, you know, I'm making a career out of answering these questions. So if you have more thoughts or things you'd like to know, please get in touch with me. I would love to answer them. I write a lot about these subjects in blogs and, you know, various things. So let me know if I can answer your questions. But yeah, I think that really my answer to that is like, the reality is your space is probably not safe for them, and that's why they're not already there. And what are you going to do to make sure that your safe space is explicitly safe for them going forward?
Thank you both so much. Yes, there is definitely a lot of questions that were so good that unfortunately couldn't get to. Definitely cannot emphasize enough to reach out about those questions. But Robin and Dylan, thank you both so much. It was such an honor to have you on the webinar tonight. You're both so brilliant and insightful, and I really enjoyed this. Please feel free to pop your contact information in the chat, whether it be social media, email, whatever you would like to share. But beyond that, thank you all so much for joining us tonight for the SIECUS Online event. We hope you continue to support SIECUS in future SIECUS Online events. I know we will likely be having one in the coming months on another new topic. But again, Robin, Dylan, thank you. This was amazing. I hope everyone has a wonderful night, and stay safe, and have a great night. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all for having me. Bye.